Before anyone congratulates us, Walter needs to read the letter I should have given him the night our first baby disappeared.
Ellie.
Eleanor raised her champagne glass with a hand that would not stop shaking. "Before anyone congratulates us," she said, looking straight at her husband, "Walter needs to read the letter I should have given him the night our first baby disappeared." The room went dead silent. Even the violinist lowered her bow. If stories about love, loss, and the kind of truth that can split a family open still mean something to you, subscribe, like this video, and stay with me until the end. Because this is one of those stories that reaches into your chest and does not let go. Walter Hayes had spent 50 years being the steadiest man in every room. At 73, his back was bent from decades under cars at his repair shop. His knuckles were thick and scarred, and his face carried the hard, quiet look of a man who believed feelings were private things that should be swallowed, not spoken. He had fixed engines, roofs, broken cabinets, leaking pipes, bad brakes, and everybody else's emergencies. But now, standing in the middle of a candlelit anniversary party while their children, grandchildren, friends, and half the church stared at him, Walter looked like he could barely remain standing. Their son Daniel had just finished a toast 2 minutes earlier. "To Mom," he had said, smiling into the microphone, "for teaching us what love looks like, and to Dad for, well, teaching us how to pay bills on time." People had laughed. Walter had laughed too. But Eleanor hadn't. She had sat there in her dark blue dress, fingertips resting on the tablecloth, eyes fixed on her husband with such strange tenderness that even Daniel's smile faltered. Now she held out a cream-colored envelope. On the front, written in her careful handwriting, were 4 words: "For the truth we buried." Walter stared at it like it might explode in his hands. "Ellie," he said softly. His wife smiled, but her eyes were wet. "Please." Their daughter Ruth whispered, "Mom, what is this?" Eleanor didn't look at her. "Tonight, your father is finally going to know that I knew." A chill moved through the room. Walter's fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter, several pages thick, and the first line hit him so hard he had to grip the table. "My dear Walter, you were never the only one who heard our son crying in the dark." His breath caught. His knees nearly gave out. And just like that, 50 years disappeared. He was 23 again, wearing a stained work shirt in a hospital corridor that smelled like bleach and fear. The night Benjamin was born had started with rain hammering the windshield so hard Walter could barely see the road. Eleanor had been in labor for 14 hours by then, sweat plastering her hair to her face, one hand crushed around his wrist, whispering through clenched teeth that if he ever touched her again, she'd break his nose. He had laughed because she needed him to laugh. He remembered kissing her forehead at every red light. He remembered saying, "We're almost there, Ellie. Stay with me." He remembered believing that if he just loved them hard enough, nothing terrible could happen. He had been wrong. Benjamin came too early, tiny, blue, silent for one horrifying second that lasted longer than a lifetime. Then came the rush of nurses, then the metal crash of instruments, then a doctor with worried eyes, then the sentence Walter would hear in his nightmares for the next 50 years. "Your son has a congenital heart defect. He needs surgery, immediately." Walter had looked from the doctor to the incubator, where something impossibly small was fighting to breathe, and asked the stupidest question of his life. "How much?" The doctor hesitated. That hesitation told him everything. They had no insurance worth talking about. Walter's hours at the machine shop had been cut for months. Their apartment radiator worked only when kicked from the side. They had $68 in checking, 11 in Eleanor's purse, and a coffee tin at home with rent money hidden in flour. The doctor talked about a specialist 2 cities away. Transfer, risk, paperwork, urgency, costs. Walter heard only one thing. Your son may die before morning. Eleanor hemorrhaged an hour later. One minute she was asking if the baby had his ears, and the next minute a nurse was shouting for blood. They pulled Walter in 2 directions at once, his wife behind one set of swinging doors, his newborn son under glass behind another. He stood between them feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his life. That was when the woman in the gray suit found him. Her name was Margaret Nolan, Hospital Social Services. She did not sit down. She did not soften her voice. She spoke with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen desperate fathers unravel before. There may be another option, she said. Walter looked at her like she had spoken another language. She explained that there was a couple in Boston, wealthy, established. They had been waiting years to adopt. The husband had family connections to one of the best pediatric cardiac surgeons in the state. If Walter signed emergency surrender papers tonight, the baby could be transferred under their medical guardianship before dawn. Walter stared at her. You're asking me to give my son away. I'm telling you, she said, that by the time you find the money you do not have, your child may already be dead. He hated her for how cleanly she said it. He hated her because she made terror sound like paperwork. He hated her because somewhere underneath that hatred, he understood she was telling the truth. I need my wife. Your wife is in surgery. I'm not signing anything without her. Margaret's face changed then. Not cruel, worse, practical. If you wait for your wife to wake up, you may be deciding between adoption and a funeral. Walter turned and slammed his fist into the corridor wall so hard the skin split across his knuckles. He had never felt so poor. Not when his father drank grocery money. Not when he wore cardboard in his shoes one winter. Not when he proposed to Eleanor with his mother's resized ring because he couldn't afford a new one. Nothing had ever humiliated him like standing in a hospital and realizing love, by itself, could not keep his child alive. He went into the chapel because he did not know where else to go. There were no stained glass windows, no choir, just bad carpet and a cross on the wall. He sat there with blood on his hand and whispered, "Please don't make me choose." No answer came. A little before dawn, the doctor found him again. We're running out of time. Walter asked one question. If I sign, will he live? The doctor didn't promise it. He only said, he'll have a chance. That almost made it worse. Because a chance is enough to destroy a man. Walter signed. His hand shook so hard his name barely looked like his name. When Eleanor finally woke up, pale and weak and searching the room with frightened eyes, the first thing she asked was, "Where is my baby?" Walter stood beside her bed and felt his soul leave his body. He could have told her the truth. He could have said, "Our son is alive, but not ours anymore." He could have said, "I was afraid, and I chose his heartbeat over our future." He could have said, "I did this without you, and I will spend the rest of my life hating myself for it." Instead, because he saw stitches in her skin and color draining from her face, and because he was a coward in the exact way devastated young men become cowards, he said the one sentence he believed would hurt her least in the moment and ruin them most in the years to come. He didn't make it, Ellie. Her whole face changed. Not dramatically, not like in movies. It was quieter than that. Her mouth parted. Her eyes lost their focus, and then something inside her simply collapsed. "No," she whispered. Walter fell to his knees beside the bed. He took her hand. She pulled it away. "Let me see him." The lie got bigger. They already took him. Why? He was too small. That was the first moment Walter watched grief turn into something physical. Eleanor curled toward the wall and made a sound he would hear in his sleep for the next half-century. A low, broken sound, like a person trying not to scream because screaming would make it real. He stood there and let her believe their son had died. Then he went into the parking lot and threw up beside a dumpster. At the anniversary party, Walter stopped reading. His eyes blurred. Ruth stepped toward him. "Dad?" But Eleanor touched her arm. "Let him." Walter kept going. The next part of the letter was worse. 3 days after you told me Ben was gone, a nurse came into my room while you were downstairs fighting with the billing office. She was older, red hair, crooked front tooth. She closed the door before she spoke. She asked me if I wanted the truth, even if it made healing harder. Walter, I think she had daughters of her own, because she cried before I did. Walter's hand shook so violently the pages rustled. He looked up at Eleanor. She nodded once. "Go on." He swallowed. "She told me our baby had not died. She told me you signed papers before sunrise. She told me a family with money took him to Boston for surgery. She said you had been standing in the hall with blood on your hand and tears on your face when you signed. She said you kept asking only one thing. Will he live?" A gasp moved across the room. Daniel's face drained of color. Ruth covered her mouth. Walter could not feel his feet anymore. In the letter, Eleanor's words did not accuse him. That somehow hurt more. "I hated you for 1 hour, maybe 2. I want to tell the truth, since truth is all that is left. I hated you because you made a decision that belonged to both of us. I hated you because I woke up empty and you gave me a grave instead of an explanation. But then I pictured you alone in that hallway, 23 years old, broke, terrified, trying to save our child and me at the same time. And I knew hatred was too small for what had happened to us." Walter shut his eyes. He remembered going home to their apartment afterward. The crib still in pieces against the wall because he had planned to assemble it that weekend. The yellow blanket Eleanor had knitted draped over the chair. The rubber duck his sister mailed from Ohio sitting by the sink because Eleanor said babies liked bright colors. He remembered taking the blanket, pressing it to his face, and sobbing into it so hard he bit the cloth to keep the neighbors from hearing. He remembered Eleanor coming into the room quietly. For one insane second, he thought she knew. But she only touched the blanket, then touched his shoulder, and asked, "Did he suffer?" Walter had answered, "No." Another lie. The smallest lie. The kind meant as mercy. The kind that becomes poison. The years after Benjamin did not destroy them all at once. That would have been simpler. What happened instead was slower, meaner. They stayed together. They even loved each other. But grief moved in with them and never paid rent. Walter started working 2 jobs, not because they needed all the money immediately, because idleness meant hearing phantom cries. Eleanor smiled less after dark. The first time she saw a blue baby sweater in a store window, she went so pale Walter had to lead her outside. They tried for another child, and failed twice. Each month became a private funeral. Then came Daniel, red-faced and furious and very much alive. Walter held him with shaking hands and did not sleep for the first week because he kept putting his finger under the baby's nose to make sure he was still breathing. Eleanor noticed. She noticed everything. She noticed how he flinched whenever hospitals appeared on television, how he kept every bill in labeled envelopes, as if organization could keep catastrophe away, how he fixed toys for neighborhood children for free, then sat alone in the garage afterwards staring at nothing, how he stood in Daniel's doorway at night long after the boy was asleep, how, when Ruth was born 4 years later, he cried before she did. And for 50 years, he believed Eleanor saw only the distance his guilt created, not the wound underneath it. But her letter stripped that illusion away. I knew why you became hard, Walter. You were not born cold. You became careful. Careful men are often mistaken for loveless men by the very people they have spent their lives trying to protect. Daniel lowered his eyes. The words landed on him like stones. Because it was true. He had spent years quietly resenting his father. Walter never cheered the loudest at baseball games, never gave big speeches, never said, "I'm proud of you," easily. When Daniel failed his first semester of college and came home expecting comfort, Walter had only said, "Then fix it." When Ruth's marriage collapsed, Walter repaired her broken fence, changed the locks, filled her freezer, and never once said the words she was aching to hear. People called him stern, difficult, emotionally unavailable. Even tonight, in Daniel's toast, the whole room had laughed at that idea. But now everybody was beginning to understand. Some men grow up learning love as language. Others learn it as labor. Walter had spent half a century begging forgiveness without ever using the words. The letter continued. Do you remember our 15th anniversary, when you forgot the reservation, came home late, and found me sitting on the porch in the dark? Walter looked up sharply. He remembered every second. He had, in fact, remembered it as one of the great failures of his marriage. He had worked 14 hours, gotten grease on the only jacket he owned, and driven home in panic because Eleanor deserved one night that did not smell like exhaust and debt. He had found her sitting on the porch steps. She had looked at him, smiled sadly, and said, "You forgot." He had no defense. So he handed her a small paper bag. Inside was a tiny silver baby rattle from an antique shop. Eleanor had stared at it a long time. Then she had burst into tears. Walter had spent years thinking he had reopened a wound. Now he read her explanation. I did not cry because you hurt me. I cried because I realized you had never forgotten Ben for a single day. Neither had I. Ruth was openly crying now. One of the grandchildren clung to her dress, confused by the tension in the room. Still, Eleanor had not moved from her chair. Her breathing was shallow. Her hands were folded in her lap. And Walter suddenly understood this night had not been impulsive. She had planned it with the seriousness of someone arranging the last truth of her life. His heartbeat quickened. He kept reading. 3 years ago, when Daniel gave me that silly home DNA test for Christmas because he thought it would be funny to know whether we were more Irish or more English, I nearly threw it away. Then I kept it. I do not know why. Maybe mothers never stop listening for doors they were told would never open again. A murmur spread across the room. Daniel stared at his mother. "Mom." She didn't answer. Walter's vision tunneled. I sent in the test without telling you. 6 weeks later, I got a result I had spent 50 years pretending not to hope for. A close family match. Male. 50 years old, living 2 states away. His name is Ben Carter. Walter made a sound that did not belong to any language. Ruth grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. Daniel whispered, "No." Walter looked at the page as if the letters might rearrange into mercy. They didn't. I stared at his name for an hour before I clicked it. Then I stared at his photograph and saw your mouth, my eyes, and the expression of a stranger who had spent his whole life wondering who had first let him go. Walter's chest caved inward. Ben. Alive. Not gone. Not a grave. A man. A whole man somewhere in the world, while Walter had been mourning him like a ghost. The room vanished. He saw only all the years he had lost. First steps. First word. First bicycle. School pictures. Broken hearts. Birthdays. Fever nights. College. Everything. All of it gone. Or worse. Lived without him. He kept reading through tears. I wrote to him carefully. I did not tell him everything at once. I only said I believed I was his biological mother, and that if he ever wanted answers, I would give him every answer I had. He did not reply for 2 months. I thought I had frightened him. Then a letter came. Walter stopped to wipe his face. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely audible. "He wrote you?" Eleanor nodded. Walter read aloud now without meaning to, because the words were too heavy to keep inside. He asked if I had abandoned him because he was unwanted. He asked if his father knew he existed. He asked if the story he had been told was true, that 2 scared young parents had given him up without a second thought and gone on to build a happy family somewhere else. Walter folded over at the waist. The sound that came out of him shattered every soul in the room. "No," he choked. "No." For 50 years he had imagined his son dead. He had never forced himself to imagine something harder. His son alive enough to wonder why he had not been loved enough to stay. Eleanor waited until he could breathe again. Then, softly, almost like she was comforting the young man he used to be, she said, "Keep reading, Walter." He read. I told him the truth as best I could tell it. I told him you were a poor young husband standing in a hallway with a dying baby and a bleeding wife. I told him fear made the choice, but love signed the paper. I told him if there is blame, it belongs to a world where money gets to decide which children deserve a chance to live. Daniel turned away and covered his face. Because that was the real villain in the story. Not Walter. Not even the lie. Poverty. Pride. A system cold enough to put a pen into a desperate father's hand and call it consent. But the letter was not finished. Ben wrote back. Then we called. Then we met. The room exploded. Ruth looked at her mother in stunned disbelief. "You met him?" Eleanor's eyes filled. "Yes." "When?" Daniel asked. "A year ago." "You met our brother for a year and didn't tell us?" His voice cracked with hurt. Eleanor finally looked at him then. "You were not ready to understand your father yet." That silenced him. Walter's lips trembled. "You met him," he repeated, not to accuse, but because his mind could not hold it. She nodded again. "He was angry. He had every right to be." Walter looked back at the letter. "The first time I saw him, he did not hug me. He sat across from me in a diner and asked why I had come now, when 50 years had already been stolen. I told him because I was running out of cowardice. That made him laugh in spite of himself. He has your laugh, Walter. Short, disbelieving, like joy always surprises him. Walter laughed once then, but it broke in half and turned into a sob. I wanted to tell you right away. I almost did. But Ben asked me for one thing. He said, before I meet him, I need to know whether he ever wanted me. Don't give me a movie ending if the truth is uglier. That sentence nearly killed me, Walter, because I knew the only person who could answer it was you. And I also knew you had spent 50 years punishing yourself too hard to believe you deserved to answer at all. Walter dropped into the chair behind him. Guests were crying now. Even the men who thought tears were private were no longer winning that fight. He read the final page. So tonight, on our 50th anniversary, I am giving you the truth back. I knew. I have always known. And I stayed. Not because I was weak, not because what you did not break me. I stayed because I saw what it cost you. I stayed because every time you checked our baby's breathing, every extra shift you worked, every dollar you hid in emergency envelopes, every fence you repaired, every silent drive home from school concerts where you said too little but showed up anyway, I knew the same thing. The worst thing you ever did was done while trying to save us. And now I need you to know one more thing. Ben is here. Walter stopped breathing. The room turned as one. At the back of the hall, near the open doors, stood a man in a charcoal jacket with silver at his temples and both hands clenched so tightly at his sides they were white. He had Walter's jaw, Eleanor's eyes, and the posture of someone who had almost left 3 different times before forcing himself to stay. Nobody moved. Walter stood so fast his chair toppled behind him. For a terrible second, Ben did not walk forward. The old fear came back all at once. What if he was only here to look at the people who lost him? What if he wanted nothing? What if this was not redemption? What if this was simply judgment, 50 years late? Walter opened his mouth. No sound came. Then Ben spoke first. Mom said you'd probably look like the world was ending. A few nervous laughs escaped through tears. Walter's face collapsed. I'm sorry, he whispered. Ben nodded once, but his own eyes were red. I know. No, Walter said, and now the words came harder, rougher, torn straight from somewhere buried alive. No, you don't. You can't. I have been sorry every day since the day I signed my name. There has not been a birthday or Christmas or random Tuesday I didn't think about you. I told myself you were dead because I didn't know how to survive knowing you were alive without me. That is the truth. Ugly enough for you? Ben swallowed. The room was listening so hard no one dared shift in their seat. Walter took one shaky step forward. I wanted you. God, I wanted you. I was just a scared idiot with empty pockets and a wife I thought I might lose. I thought I was choosing your life. Then I lied to the woman I loved because I couldn't bear to watch her hate me too. If you need someone to blame, blame me. If you need to walk out, walk out. But don't ever let that story stand that you were unwanted. You were wanted before you had a face. You were wanted when all I knew was your heartbeat. You were wanted every miserable day after. Ben's mouth tightened. He looked away, then back. My adoptive father died 5 years ago, he said. Before he died, he gave me the file, the real one. He said he'd promised my mother they would never contact you, but he wanted me to know one thing before he went. Ben's voice cracked. He said the hospital staff talked about you for years. Said my father nearly had to be dragged away from the incubator. Walter broke. Actually broke. Not crying, not tearing up. He folded inward with both hands over his face like the weight of 50 years had finally landed all at once. Eleanor pushed herself up from her chair. Ruth rushed to help her, but Eleanor shook her head and walked slowly to her husband. When she reached him, she touched the center of his back the same way she had touched him in kitchens, waiting rooms, church pews, and graveside winters for half a century. "Walter," she whispered. He looked at her through tears. "Why didn't you hate me?" She smiled with a sadness so deep it looked holy. "Oh, I did, for a little while," she said. "Then life gave me a better use for my love." Ben took a step forward, then another. Then he stood in front of the two people who had spent 50 years haunted by the same night from opposite sides of it. "I'm still angry," he admitted. Eleanor nodded. "You should be. I missed a life with you." Walter said, "I know." Ben's jaw trembled. "And you missed one with me." Walter could only nod. Then Ben exhaled, like a man setting down something heavy. "But I also know this. People who don't want their child don't spend 50 years grieving him." Nobody in the room could hold back anymore. Ben looked at Walter, not as a stranger now, but as a man trying to decide whether pain had room for mercy. "Mom showed me the letters." Walter frowned. Eleanor smiled through tears. "The ones you wrote him every birthday." Walter had forgotten those. No, not forgotten. Hidden. Every year, on Benjamin's birthday, Walter sat at the workbench in the garage and wrote a letter to a dead son. At least that was what he told himself. He wrote about Daniel learning to ride a bike, about Ruth's first piano recital, about how Eleanor still stole the crispy corner pieces of lasagna, about how sorry he was, about how, if heaven was real, maybe boys there could grow up knowing they were loved. He never mailed them. He stacked them in a cigar box beneath old receipts and rusted bolts. Eleanor had found them years ago. Ben stepped closer. "I read every one." Walter stared at him. "I didn't know what to do after that," Ben said. "It's hard to keep believing you were thrown away when you're holding 32 years of letters from a father who never stopped talking to you." Walter let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. Ben opened his arms awkwardly, like he wasn't practiced at moments like this. Walter didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance and held his son for the first time in 50 years. The hall disappeared in the force of it. Guests stood crying. Ruth clung to Daniel. Daniel wept openly, the kind of crying sons do when they suddenly realize how badly they misunderstood the man who raised them. And Eleanor watched all of it with tears on her cheeks and peace, finally peace, settling into the lines of her face. Walter pulled back just enough to look at Ben. "I can't ask you to call me Dad." Ben gave a watery smile. "Good, because that would be weird on the first night." Laughter broke through the tears. Then Ben added, quieter, "But I can call you tomorrow, if you want." Walter nodded so fast he could barely breathe. "I want." That might have been the moment the party ended and the real family began. Not perfect, not repaired, but opened. The grandchildren met their new great-uncle and asked innocent questions only children are brave enough to ask. Ruth held Ben's hands and kept saying, "You have Mom's eyes," like she was trying to memorize him.
Daniel took too long to speak, then finally told Walter, "I'm sorry for that toast."
Walter looked at his son, really looked at him, and managed the words that had always been hardest for him. "You weren't wrong about what it felt like." Daniel started crying again. Later, long after the cake had gone untouched and the musicians had quietly packed away their instruments, Walter sat beside Eleanor in the now half-empty hall. He held the letter in both hands like it was something alive. "You gave me back my son tonight," he said. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "No, I gave you back the truth. Your son chose to walk through that door." Walter turned to her. "Why tonight?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, that old, brave smile he had fallen in love with when they were both too young to understand what real love would eventually cost. "Because 50 years is long enough for punishment," she said. "And because anniversaries should celebrate what's survived." Walter kissed her forehead, the way he had in the car on the night everything began. For the first time in half a century, he did not hear a baby crying in the dark. He heard laughter in the next room. His son's laughter. And that was enough to make even a man like Walter Hayes believe that sometimes love does not arrive on time, but it still arrives. Some letters come too late to change the past, but just in time to rescue the future. Tell me in the comments, do you believe the deepest love is shown by the truth we speak, or by the pain we carry for the people we could not bear to lose?